Think your late-night kebab is questionable? Try Victorian street food. In the slums of 19th-century London, the streets were the city's food court. Smoke, soot, and the smell of fried eels filled the air as hawkers shouted over the chaos, selling quick, cheap meals to workers who couldn't afford a kitchen, let alone a restaurant. This was fast food before the term existed. No drive-thrus, no hygiene standards, and definitely no refrigeration. But for millions living hand-to-mouth, these vendors kept them alive. Let's step into the streets and see what was really on the menu. Hot eels. Nothing screams Victorian London like the smell of hot eels. The Thames was so full of them that catching eels became a thriving trade. Street vendors sold them boiled with herbs and vinegar or stewed in a thick parsley sauce. A penny got you a small bowl, hot, salty, and, by all accounts, surprisingly satisfying. Eel stalls became iconic, complete with their own slang and loyal customers. Charles Dickens mentioned them in Pickwick Papers. The dish was cheap, protein-rich, and available all year, which made it perfect for workers who needed calories more than comfort. Here's the disturbing part. Those Thames eels were swimming in what was essentially an open sewer. By the 1850s, London's waste, industrial runoff, and human sewage all flowed into the Thames. Parliamentary records describe the river as black as ink during summer months. The Great Stink of 1858 became so bad that Parliament considered relocating entirely. Yet eels thrived in these toxic conditions, filtering contaminated water through their bodies before ending up in street vendor pots. The tradition survived long enough that jellied eels remain a cultural relic of East London today, one of the few Victorian street foods that never quite died out. Baked potatoes. If one smell defined Victorian winter nights, it was roasting potatoes. Street corners glowed with small coal stoves where vendors baked potatoes in piles, selling them piping hot straight from the ashes. They were cheap, filling, and warm. For people living in unheated lodgings, a baked potato provided both dinner and temporary heating. Writers at the time described poor children clutching them for warmth before eating the skin and all. A halfpenny could buy one, and vendors often worked until midnight, serving factory workers heading home. The potatoes themselves were usually the rejected specimens from markets, too small, damaged, or partially rotted for regular sale. Vendors would cut away obviously bad portions, but might leave questionable sections. The butter or dripping added as topping came from uncertain sources, sitting in carts all day without refrigeration. Still, compared to most street food, baked potatoes were relatively safe. The high heat killed most bacteria, and the product was recognizable. Social reformers promoting improved street food safety often recommended potatoes as an acceptable option. The potato may be humble, but in Victorian slums it was a symbol of survival, fast, cheap, and portable. Whelks, mussels, and periwinkles. Seafood might sound luxurious, but not when it's cold, rubbery, and sold from a bucket. London's street vendors sold boiled whelks, mussels, and periwinkles for pennies, served with a splash of vinegar or pepper. Customers ate them standing on the curb, using pins to extract the meat from the shell. These shellfish came from the Thames estuary, which was, to put it mildly, not pristine. The same sewage-contaminated waters that produced the eels also produced these shellfish. As filter feeders, they pumped polluted water through their bodies, concentrating whatever pathogens and toxins existed in the water. Medical records from the 1850s and 1860s show repeated outbreaks of disease traced to shellfish consumption. Typhoid, cholera, and various gastrointestinal diseases spread readily through contaminated whelks and mussels. The storage made things worse. Shellfish sat in open containers on street carts for hours or days, exposed to air, flies, and repeated handling by vendors with questionable hygiene. Dead shellfish mixed with live ones. Contemporary health inspectors repeatedly warned about seafood left unrefrigerated for days. But for most buyers, hunger outweighed hygiene. Victorians valued calories and salt over sanitation. Pies and pasties. Hot meat pies were a favourite among workers, though meat was a flexible concept. Pie sellers roamed the streets shouting their wares, carrying stacks of small pies in portable tin ovens strapped to their chests. They sold for a penny each, filled with everything from mutton scraps to mysterious mixtures best not examined too closely. Analysis of Victorian street food from the 1850s revealed that many pies contained almost no actual beef or pork. Investigation reports from London's sanitary inspectors describe finding horse meat, dog meat, and in some cases, meat from animals that had died of disease. Criminal court records from 1847 mention a pie vendor prosecuted after several customers became violently ill. Investigation revealed he'd been using meat from a horse that died 3 days earlier. Heavy spicing and cooking disguised the taste of spoiled meat. The crusts had their own issues. Flour was expensive, so many vendors mixed in cheaper fillers. Ground peas, sawdust, and even plaster of Paris appeared in pie crusts to stretch the dough. Pork pies, eel pies, and even rabbit pies turned up on street corners. The crust served as both container and plate, making them perfect early fast food, quick, handheld, and filling. If you were lucky, you got actual meat. If not, you still got a hot meal. Pea soup and hot coffee stalls. Before the modern cafe, there were pea soup and coffee stalls. These were the Victorian equivalent of food trucks, small wheeled kitchens serving cheap hot drinks and simple soups to night workers. Pea soup, thickened with split peas and a hint of ham or bacon, was sold in tin mugs. The soup's thickness concealed numerous problems. Vendors often started with dried peas, but stretched it extensively with water, salt, and whatever else was available. Investigative reports from social reformers describe finding soup with barely any peas at all, just coloured water thickened with flour or even clay. Meat bones added flavour, but the source raised serious questions. Vendors purchased discarded bones from butchers or collected them from other sources. These bones might have been gnawed by dogs, left in trash heaps, or come from diseased animals. One court case from 1863 involved a soup vendor found using bones stolen from a cemetery. The pots themselves rarely got properly cleaned. At day's end, vendors would add new ingredients to whatever remained from the previous batch, creating an endless soup that might contain portions weeks old. Coffee stalls opened late and stayed until dawn, catering to cab drivers, police, and market porters. The coffee was usually chicory-based and heavily sweetened, but it was hot, cheap, and comforting. Water quality was the primary concern. Vendors used whatever was available from public pumps, many of which drew from contaminated sources. By the 1880s, London had over 1,000 such stalls, each with its own regular crowd. They were social hubs as much as food stops, the city's first taste of round-the-clock dining. Hot chestnuts. Another winter staple was roasted chestnuts, the Victorian version of street popcorn. Vendors carried small braziers filled with glowing coals and paper cones for serving. The sweet, nutty smell became part of the city's soundtrack. Even middle-class passers-by sometimes bought a cone for a penny or two. For poorer Londoners, chestnuts were quick, cheap energy, easily shared among friends or family. The chestnuts themselves were natural, recognizable products that were difficult to adulterate significantly. The roasting process was visible, and the high heat killed potential contaminants. Some vendors mixed in inferior chestnuts or those that had started to rot, hoping roasting would disguise quality issues. The damaged sections might be cut away, but spores from rot could spread through good portions. Unlike many other street foods, chestnuts were relatively safe to eat, which probably explains why even social reformers approved of them. A rare Victorian snack that managed to be both wholesome and affordable. Fried fish. Before fish and chips conquered Britain, there was just fried fish. Jewish immigrants introduced the idea of frying fish in batter, and Londoners quickly embraced it. Vendors sold pieces of fried fish wrapped in paper, easy to carry, easy to eat. A few pennies got you a warm, greasy portion that smelled glorious and filled you up fast. The fish itself came primarily from the Thames and surrounding waters, which by the 1850s were heavily polluted. The fish caught from this toxic water accumulated contaminants in their flesh. Medical journals from the 1860s noted increased cases of digestive ailments among regular consumers of Thames fish. The cooking oil posed additional dangers. Vendors rarely changed their frying oil, using the same batch for days or weeks until it became thick and rancid. The oil accumulated food particles, burned residue, and whatever contaminants came from the fish itself. One health inspector's report from 1872 described examining a fish vendor's oil and finding it more solid than liquid, black in color, and emitting noxious fumes. Despite these issues, by the late 1800s, fried fish stalls dotted working-class neighborhoods, laying the groundwork for the iconic fish and chips shop. One of the few Victorian street foods that survived and thrived, defining British cuisine for generations. Oysters. Oysters were remarkably cheap in Victorian London, sold from barrows by street vendors who kept them in barrels of water. Workers could buy a half-dozen oysters for a penny, eating them raw right on the street. The oysters came from the Thames estuary and surrounding coastal waters, harvesting areas that received all of London's sewage discharge. Oysters are filter feeders, pumping water through their bodies to extract nutrients. In the process, they accumulated whatever pollutants and pathogens existed in the water. Victorian oyster beds essentially sat in sewage-contaminated water. The oysters filtered this toxic mixture, concentrating bacteria, viruses, and parasites in their flesh. Eating them raw meant consuming everything those oysters had filtered. Medical records from the 1850s and 1860s show repeated outbreaks of disease traced to oyster consumption. One particularly severe outbreak in 1849 affected hundreds of people in London, with several deaths linked to contaminated oysters from specific vendors. The storage conditions worsened the problem. Vendors kept oysters in barrels of water that sat on carts for days. Dead oysters mixed with live ones, and the water became increasingly contaminated. The shucking knife was used all day, cleaned rarely, if at all, transferring bacteria from one oyster to another. Despite this, oysters remained popular because they were cheap and filling. Hot peas, tripe, and oddities. Street vendors were endlessly inventive. Boiled tripe, cow stomach lining, was sold in cups, seasoned with vinegar and pepper. Others hawked hot green peas or mashed turnips, ladled straight into mugs. Some stalls even sold sheep's trotters, cheap, gelatinous, and extremely popular with the poorest Londoners. Sheep's trotters were the feet, boiled and sold as cheap street food. Vendors kept large pots warming over fires, selling them to workers who would gnaw the meat and connective tissue off the bones. These extremities had walked through slaughterhouse floors covered in blood, waste, and other animal parts. Cleaning was minimal. Vendors would rinse them briefly and throw them in the pot, but this eliminated little contamination. The boiling water used for trotters rarely got changed. Vendors would add new trotters to the same water for days, creating a concentrated broth of uncertain safety. The pot accumulated scum and residue, which might be skimmed off occasionally but never thoroughly cleaned. Victorian newspapers describe vendors balancing trays of these foods on their heads while shouting rhyming sales pitches. It was part theatre, part survival. Everyone in the slums knew the calls, the soundscape of a city feeding itself on scraps. Trotter vendors often operated in the poorest neighborhoods where desperate hunger overrode safety concerns. The extremely cheap price, sometimes just a halfpenny, meant even the most destitute could afford a meal. Gingerbread and sweets. Children and workers with a spare halfpenny could buy chunks of gingerbread, treacle toffee, or brandy balls from street sellers. The sugar trade made sweets cheap, though their quality was questionable. Vendors adulterated them with fillers like plaster dust or brick powder to cut costs. Some sweets contained toxic compounds. Coloring agents came from lead or arsenic-based dyes. Victorian food safety regulations were minimal, and vendors used whatever made their products look appealing. Reformers were horrified by what they called the poisonous confectionery trade. Investigation reports describe finding sweets colored with substances never intended for consumption. Some red colorings contained mercury. Yellow and green often came from lead compounds. These adulterations were done through ignorance of the dangers rather than malice. Vendors purchased whatever dyes were available and assumed they were safe for food use. Despite the dangers, demand remained high. For many children, these street sweets were the only luxury they ever knew. The sugar content and taste of pleasure in lives dominated by work and want outweighed concerns about safety most people didn't even understand. Muffins and crumpets. The muffin man walking the streets with his tray of baked goods seems charming in retrospect, but Victorian reality was less appealing. These vendors sold muffins, crumpets, and other baked items from trays balanced on their heads or carried on poles. The baked goods came from small bakeries operating in questionable conditions. Investigation reports from Victorian sanitary inspectors describe bakeries in basements with dirt floors, minimal ventilation, and rats visible during inspections. Flour adulteration was rampant. Pure flour was expensive, so bakeries mixed in cheaper substitutes. Alum was commonly added to whiten flour and make bread appear fresher. Ground bones provided additional bulk. Some flour contained plaster of Paris or chalk. The street-selling process added more concerns. Muffin men carried their goods uncovered, exposed to street dust, smoke from coal fires, and horse manure kicked up by constant traffic. By the time a muffin reached a customer, it had been breathing London's toxic air for hours. Vendors often sold day-old or older baked goods purchased cheaply from bakeries. They would sprinkle these items with water to make them seem fresh, but this moisture created conditions for mold growth. Ginger beer and lemonade. Street vendors sold various beverages from portable carts, with ginger beer being particularly popular. Vendors made this sweetened, slightly fermented drink, and sold it in stone bottles or ceramic jugs. The production process created numerous contamination opportunities. Vendors made ginger beer in whatever containers they had available, often barrels or large pots cleaned inadequately. The fermentation process required the mixture to sit for days, during which contamination could occur. Water quality was the primary concern. Vendors used whatever water was available from public pumps, many drawing from contaminated sources. The sugar and ginger masked unpleasant tastes, but couldn't neutralize actual pathogens. The bottles themselves posed risks. Stone ginger beer bottles were reused constantly, but rarely cleaned thoroughly. Vendors would rinse and refill them, but this inadequate cleaning left residue and bacteria. Some bottles cracked or chipped, creating harbors for bacteria that couldn't be cleaned out. Lemonade vendors operated similarly, mixing lemon juice, sugar, and water in large containers. On hot days, lemonade would sit in the sun for hours, reaching temperatures ideal for bacterial multiplication. Medical reports noted increased illness during summer months, partly attributed to contaminated beverages. Some vendors adulterated their beverages to increase profit. Sulfuric acid was added to lemonade to increase tartness while reducing actual lemon juice. Lead chromate provided yellow coloring when lemon content was minimal. Ice cream. Ice cream vendors appeared in Victorian London, particularly during summer months. They sold small portions from insulated carts, offering a rare cold treat to working-class customers. The ice used in production came from questionable sources. Some vendors purchased ice harvested from ponds and canals, the same waterways that received sewage and industrial waste. This ice was used both to cool the mixture and sometimes mixed directly into it to increase volume. The cream and milk often came from urban dairies operating in appalling conditions. Cows kept in basement stalls, fed on brewery waste, produced milk with questionable safety and nutritional value. This swill milk was linked to numerous infant deaths and illnesses. Sweetening presented additional risks. Sugar was expensive, so many vendors used cheaper alternatives. Lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, was sometimes added for sweetness. This highly toxic compound gave a sweet taste, but caused severe lead poisoning. Analysis of Victorian ice cream samples occasionally revealed dangerous levels of lead contamination. Coloring agents added visual appeal, but carried dangers. Bright colors came from compounds never intended for consumption. Some red colorings contained mercury. Yellow and green often came from lead or arsenic-based dyes. The serving equipment was rarely clean. The same scoop would be used for hours without washing, transferring bacteria between customers. The carts weren't refrigerated properly, allowing ice cream to partially melt and refreeze repeatedly, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth. The bigger picture. Victorian street food's problems stemmed from a combination of poverty, ignorance, and lack of regulation. Vendors were trying to survive in an economic system that left them few options. The cheapest ingredients were often the most dangerous. When a vendor could purchase condemned meat for a fraction of fresh meat's cost, the economic pressure was enormous. Many vendors lived in the same poverty as their customers and made choices driven by desperation. Food safety knowledge was limited even among medical professionals. Germ theory became widely accepted only in the late Victorian period. Many contamination sources we now understand simply weren't recognized at the time. Vendors had no concept of bacterial growth, cross-contamination, or the specific dangers of certain adulterants. Regulation was minimal and poorly enforced. Some food safety laws existed, but investigation and prosecution required resources that local authorities lacked. The sheer number of street vendors made systematic inspection impossible. Even when authorities identified dangerous practices, vendors might simply relocate to avoid prosecution. The customer base had limited alternatives. Factory workers needed cheap, quick meals. They couldn't go home for lunch, and they couldn't afford restaurant prices. Street food represented the only option for millions of working people. Even those who suspected quality issues had little choice but to purchase and hope for the best. Social reformers documented these issues extensively. Charles Dickens wrote about contaminated street food. Henry Mayhew's interviews with street vendors revealed the stark economic realities. Medical journals published analyses of food samples. Yet change came slowly, and dangerous practices continued throughout the Victorian period and beyond. So what did Victorian street food really look like? It was quick, cheap, and everywhere. The first fast food system built for a city that never stopped working. Every roasted potato, cup of soup, or penny pie told the same story: survival with a touch of ingenuity. The next time you grab a takeaway, remember, you're part of a tradition that began in the smoky streets of Victorian London. Which of these would you actually try? The baked potato? The hot eels? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this trip through history's first fast food scene, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories about how ordinary people really lived and ate in the past. Thanks for watching.